Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 2, lesson 2 in volume 1 of our Bible study lessons with John Warner. This week is very special because John has been studying the Shroud of Turin for about 30 years. And you may or may not know about him that he's an attorney. So he's very meticulous in his research and data and really values the truth and integrity behind it. So he's got a lot of great information on here, and I'm excited to jump into it today. So welcome to the Bible study. For those of you who are not here live, if you happen to miss the live, you can catch all of our replays in the actual Facebook group. And if you would like to get an email reminder, you can also put your email in the chat and we will send you an email reminder every week. But you can also find any updates and information or questions in the Facebook group as well. So thanks again for being here. I appreciate it. So I want to welcome you all and also welcome you, John. Thanks for being here. So without further ado, we can get started on lesson 2, chapter 2.
In the city of Turin, Italy today is a piece of ivory-covered linen. It's 14 feet 3 inches long and 3 feet 7 inches wide. Now, on the linen is the pale and subtle image of a man. It's a negative image. That means the dark places appear white and the white places appear dark. It has a history dating back more than 500 years. Before the invention of photography. The linen is a 3-in-1 herringbone twill, which was used in ancient times and was considered expensive. That is, the person who purchased it must have been a wealthy man because this is an expensive burial cloth. Now, the man of Turin, as he's sometimes called, was between 30 and 45 years old at the time of his death. He was 5 feet 11 inches tall and weighed 170 pounds. He was well developed with his right shoulder a little more developed than his left shoulder, which suggested that he might have had a manual trade of some kind. Perhaps a carpenter. He had long hair, which was in an unbound single pigtail to the bottom of his shoulders. He had a beard, which suggested that he was probably a Jew because Romans were clean shaven in the first century. Now, on the back of the man of Turin's head were 8 puncture wounds, and there were 4 or 5 more on the front of his head, which suggested that shortly before his death, a cap of sharp objects was pressed into his skull. On his eyes are 2 coins minted by Pontius Pilate. I've read one authority that suggested 30 AD, and I read one today that suggested 29 AD. But they were minted about 3 years before the death of Jesus Christ. Now, both eyelids were swollen. And he had a torn red eyelid. There was a large swelling below his right eye, below it. And he had a swollen nose. And a doctor that I saw on the internet today suggested that he had a broken nose. But that's the first that I've heard that theory. But he had a large swelling below his right eye. He had a swollen nose. He had a triangular shaped wound on his right cheek with the apex pointing to his nose. He had a swollen left cheek and a swollen left chin. Now, on his backs are between 90 and 100 scourge marks, which indicate that shortly before his death, he was whipped by two men, one a little taller than the other, and one with a tendency to lash the legs because that would create more pain. In Spain recently, the Shroud of Turin had not an actual showing, but they had created an image of a man based upon the Shroud of Turin, and you could physically then see the scourge marks all over his body. You could see the marks in the hair. You could see them on his legs, on his back, on his chest, but he was horribly beaten. And these beatings were so severe that many people died before they were ever crucified. But now, the scourge marks perfectly matched a Roman whip called a flagrum or a flagellum. Now, it was a whip that had three prongs on it, and there was one in the middle, and the two on the side were studded with bone or with metal, so they would curl around and inflict more pain upon the victim. Now, on his upper back, superimposed over the scourge marks, is quadrangular shading. The crossbeam of a cross weighed 100 pounds in the first century. And it could have resulted in such chafing, particularly if Christ had suffered falls as he was going up to Golgotha, the place of the skull, where he would ultimately be crucified. Now, Luke tells us, and would you read Luke 23 and 26 for us, please, Melanie? Second paragraph on page 27.
Sorry, I was muted. As the crowd led Jesus away to his death, Simon of Cyrene, who was just coming into Jerusalem from the country, was forced to follow carrying Jesus's cross.
Okay, and Cyrene was in Africa. If you would read Matthew 27 and 32, please.
As they were on the way to the execution grounds, they came across a man from Cyrene in Africa. Simon was his name, and forced him to carry Jesus' cross. It's interesting to see the same reference from two different stories in the Bible, because I think that's considering that they wrote them separately. You know, that's an interesting validation. So sorry, I just wanted to make a quick note there.
Well, I want you to picture the scene as Christ was going up the hill. He was led by four Roman soldiers, one in front, one in behind, and one on either side. And these Roman soldiers were each given a perk for participating in the crucifixion. So one would get his shoes, one got his turban, one got his girdle, one got his tunic, and then they gambled. They threw dice to see who got the shroud. So could you read it for us, please, John 19 and 23?
When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments and made 4 pants one for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was without seam, woven from top to bottom. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be. This was to fulfill the scripture. Psalms 22:18. They parted my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots.
Now, legend has it that Mary made this robe for Jesus as her last parting gift to him before he went out on his 3-year ministry. This was a tradition that Jewish women often made. Now, there was no sign of broken legs on Jesus' body. In the Bible, it says his legs were not broken. And on the Shroud of Turin, the man of Turin's legs were not broken. But the reason they were broken was to hasten death, because that means they lost their ability to push up on their feet when the pain got too severe. Now, John 19:32 attests to that. Melanie, if you'd read that on page 28, please.
So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the two men crucified with Jesus. But when they came to him, they saw that he was dead already, so they didn't break his legs. However, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and blood and water flowed out.
Now, on the right side of the man of Turin is a wound showing blood and a clear substance. The wound perfectly matches a wound that would be made by a Roman spear in the 1st century. The man of Turin was crucified with his left foot crossed over his right foot, and both were nailed by a single 7-inch nail. Now, there are wounds in both wrists, and early critics of the shroud said that it couldn't be the burial shroud of Christ because the Bible said he was nailed in his hands. But the Greek word for hand is broad enough to include the wrist. Now, a French doctor in the 1930s did an experiment with cadavers. He hung them up and nailed them in the hands and found that their weight would pull through. But when he nailed them in the exact place shown on the Shroud of Turin, they not only held, but they struck the medium nerve, causing the thumb to contract into the palm. And on the Shroud of Turin, no thumbs are shown. And you wonder, some people claim this is a forgery. How could a forger have known that? How could they have figured that out? Now, another criticism of the shroud is that the man of Turin was unwashed, and the tradition was to wash a person before they were placed in the tomb. But let's think together for a minute. Christ was put on the cross at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he was there for 6 hours, and he died at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And Melanie, again, if you read on page 29, Luke 23, 44, and 46, please.
By now it was noon, and darkness fell across the whole land for 3 hours until 3 o'clock. Then Jesus shouted, "Father, I commit my spirit to you." And with those words, he died.
Now, Joseph of Arimathea was a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, which was a Jewish Supreme Court. And he was a secret follower of Jesus, as was Nicodemus. And so the two of them went to Pontius Pilate. But the chances are, since he was late in getting there, that it was probably around 3:30 when he talked to Mary and offered his own personal tomb for Jesus' burial. And so then they made the 10-minute walk from Golgotha, the place of the skull, to Pontius Pilate's palace. And I don't care who you are, you're not going to just immediately get in to see a king. You're going to have to wait a while. So it was probably 4:15, 4:30 before he gets in to see Pontius Pilate. Well, Pilate wants to make sure that Jesus is dead. He doesn't want to release the body if Jesus is still alive. So he has one of the Roman soldiers go from the palace to Golgotha, and he runs a spear into Jesus' heart onto Jesus from Jesus' side to verify the fact that he's dead. And if Jesus is alive and somebody hits him with a spear, he's going to react. There's no indication that Jesus responded whatsoever to a spear being thrust in his side. And Romans knew how to kill people. They were experts at that. So there's absolutely no question about the fact, at this point, Jesus is dead. He died. He was crucified, died. And now Joseph of Arimathea is offering his burial place. And so the Roman soldier comes back and reports. And now Nicodemus goes out and acquires 100 pounds of spices to bury Jesus with. And Joseph of Arimathea goes out and buys a burial shroud. And so by this time, it's about 5:30, and they come back and they take Jesus down from the cross, and they wrap him in burial cloths, and they also wrap him in this shroud, or put him in this shroud. Now, normally it takes 10 minutes to walk from Golgotha to the place traditionally where Jesus is said to have been buried. But remember, they have 170 pounds of dead weight. So when they get there, it's probably a quarter or 10 minutes until 6 o'clock, and they barely have time to pack the body with 100 pounds of spices that consisted of aloe and another spice. And then everything has to stop because no work is allowed after 6 p.m. on Friday, because after 6 p.m. on Friday, it becomes a Sabbath for 24 hours. And so no Jewish man or woman can do work like burying somebody at that point. So that explains why
that still happens
Jesus was
today.
unworthy.
That still happens today in Israel. Every Friday for 24 hours, they still celebrate the Sabbath, and and everything shuts down, and they're not allowed to use any machines, like even coffee machines or pushing an elevator button. So it's interesting that even all these years later, they still in Israel celebrate that tradition.
Well, they did it religiously in the first century. Uh, Mark 14 or Mark 15:44, please. Toward the bottom of the page 29.
Pilate couldn't believe that Jesus was already dead, so he called for the Roman officer in charge and asked him. The officer confirmed the fact, and Pilate told Joseph he could have the body.
All right. On page 30, John 19 and 39, please.
Nicodemus, the man who had come to Jesus at night, came to bringing 100 pounds of embalming ointment made from myrrh and aloes.
Right. So Matthew 27 and 59 says that Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen shroud. John 19 and 40 says, together they wrapped Jesus' body in a long linen cloth saturated with the spices, as is the Jewish custom of burial. And Matthew 27 and 60 says, and placed it in his own new rock-hewn tomb and rolled a great stone across the entrance as he left. Myrrh and aloe have been confirmed on the shroud. Now, in 1988, carbon-14 testing was done on the shroud. An 8mm section was cut from a corner and a portion sent to 3 different laboratories in 3 different countries. And all 3 concluded that the shroud dated from medieval times. They estimated between 1260 and 1390.
You lost, somehow you got muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. I don't know what happened there. Sorry. Okay.
Okay. Well, in 1988, they did carbon testing. And the carbon testing that they did on what's called the Reyes corner of the shroud indicated that the shroud dated from 1260 to 1390. And at that point, I concluded that the shroud was a forgery. And I didn't do a whole lot more studying for a while. But then I learned that in 1532, the shroud had been involved in a fire, and that a very expensive process called French reweaving was used to repair it. And apparently, the Reyes corner was part of what was repaired. And that in order to get a real understanding chemically of the date of the shroud, they needed to get pieces from different parts of the shroud, just not one corner. So when they did that, when they did the new carbon testing and went from the different portions of the shroud, they came up with the dates ranging from before the 1st century to after the 1st century. So that would tend to validate the Shroud of Turin. Now, on the Reyes corner was an extract of what is called vanillum, that produces vanilla. And if something came from medieval times, it should retain approximately 37% of its vanillum. But for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls have no vanillum in them. And the Shroud of Turin has no vanillum in the image itself, but it had vanillum in the Reyes corner. And so I think that is another indication for the accuracy of the Shroud of Turin, for the reality of it. Now, two Air Force scientists, Dr. John Jackson and Dr. Eric Jumper, took pictures of the shroud through a VP8 image analyzer. And this is what scientists use to take pictures of the moon. And if the shroud were a painting, and a man in medieval times claimed that he had painted the image, but scientists have not found any brush strokes. They haven't found any indication that that's true. And if it were a painting, it would leave pigments of paint and it would leave brush strokes, neither of which are found on the shroud. But the shroud is a perfect three-dimensional image, which, you know, a painting can't be three-dimensional. The two Air Force scientists claimed that the odds that the Shroud of Turin is not the Shroud of Jesus Christ are 78,000 to 1 because of the perfect match with the description found in the Bible. Now, in an article published by the Amarillo Daily News of Amarillo, Texas, the body of the man of Turin showed no decomposition. And normally, if somebody was died and buried, 3 days later, the decomposition would have begun. Another thing that article pointed out was the blood stains on the Shroud of Turin were not disturbed. So if somebody had unwrapped the body, those blood stains would have been disturbed. But it indicates that Jesus came through the cloth, not unwrapped. Now, scientists don't have any idea of what caused the image on the shroud. It's a superficial image. It doesn't go all the way through. It's like a scorch mark, but the scorches from the 1532 fire, when you put under ultraviolet light, glow, but the image itself doesn't glow. So how could a dead body scorch a cloth? But I believe that image was made at the moment that Jesus was resurrected. So that's why scientists haven't been able to reproduce the scorch marks. Now, a Swiss doctor in the 1930s, Dr. Max Free, took a piece of tape, put it against the shroud, ripped it off, and then spent 3 years studying the fibers. And he found 6 different fibers that were consistent with fibers found only in the Holy Land. And also, the shroud contains pollen from a flower that blooms only in Jerusalem area, the Jerusalem Hebron area, between March and May each year. And the flower blooms only an hour a day. Between 3 and 4 p.m. would be the time it would have to have been picked. And the shroud contains pollen from that flower. Jean Dixon is a famous psychic, and she says the shroud is real and that In the 21st century, there's going to be significant truths discovered about it. Now, I'm not a believer in psychics, and I agree with the Pope who said that people should not base their faith on a relic. I agree with Jesus, who told a doubting Thomas that he believed because he had seen, but he blessed people who had not seen but still believed. Now, the Bible tells us that the burial garment of Christ was folded when John and Peter went into the tomb on Easter morning. And John 26:7 on page 33. Melanie, if you'd read that for us.
Page 33. Hudson, do you want to
Yeah.
read that? Read that right there. Let me read it right there.
No, you can.
John 26:7.
Go ahead. No, you read it.
He, Simon Peter, saw the strips of
Linen.
linen lying there, and as well as the burial cloth. that had-
Burial.
What?
Burial cloth.
Burial cloth that had been around Jesus's head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen.
The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen.
Thank you.
Now, this has a tremendous significance. In the first century, if a Jewish man was through eating, he would wad up his napkin and throw it on the table as a signal to the servants to come in and clean up. But if he wasn't through, if he was going to return, he would fold his napkin. Now, I believe the Shroud of Turin is real. I believe it's living proof today that Jesus was who he said he was, the Son of God. I believe it's proof that he died, was buried, and resurrected and rose from the dead. That's why his tomb was empty. And ladies and gentlemen, that cloth was folded. He's coming by. Would you bow your heads, please? Lord, help us to be ready when your Son comes back. We'd ask this thing in his name. Amen.
Oh, I just love that.
Question.
I love that it was that you were skeptical for so long and you've been studying us for so long and you looked at all the evidence as an attorney for 60 years. You know,
30 years.
well, I'm sorry, you've been an attorney for 60 years, but you've been studying it for 30 years. And I think it's pretty fair to say that it's conclusive evidence. And also it's interesting because, you know, having been to Israel, I've been to a lot of these places and I got to spend some time with one of the most prolific archaeologists of Israel. His name is Eli Shukran. And if you guys ever get a chance to go to Israel, it's pretty phenomenal experience because Eli said in Israel, the reason that they dig, the reason that he wanted to be an archaeologist was to prove that the Bible was real, right? And in America, where we're only like 200 years old, he said they just like to pat us on the head and say, oh, aren't you cute because you found some bones. But when they look and they dig and find, you know, thousands and thousands of, you know, centuries and thousands of year old things between the Roman ruins and the ancient ruins of some of these things like the Pool of Siloam and some of these places that we read about in the Bible, like he found the city of David 30 years ago and some of the most significant archaeological finds in all of the country of Israel. And I just thought it was interesting and fascinating that he said that that is the purpose and the intention behind why they do these archaeological digs is to prove the existence of Jesus and of the Bible and that God is real. And I just thought that was an interesting intention. So this made me think of that. I guess, I don't know if Sandy, if you have a question, but yeah, you might have to unmute yourself.
I didn't know that I was muted.
No, Sandy. I was gonna see if Sandy wanted to chime in or ask a question. She might have stepped away for a second. The one question I guess I have is, how did the shroud end up in Italy? Do they know? Like, why is it in Italy? Is it just on display there? Or did someone from the Vatican find it and protect it and say, let's bring it to Italy?
Well, in 1532, it was in Lille, France.
Mhm.
And then it was brought to Italy sometime after that. So, but I don't know when exactly it was brought to Turin. But it's been in Turin probably 500 years would be my guess.
Okay. Sandy says, nope, I don't have any questions. All right, she's being quiet today. Well, I think it's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that knowledge. Now, if you guys are watching this replay back in the Facebook group and you have questions, feel free to type the questions in this chat. So where you're going to see this posted and you'll see the link to watch it back, you can put questions in the chat, either here on Facebook page or on the YouTube page. So that way, if you do have specific questions, then we can also point them out to John and have him answer them specifically. Well, thank you so much for you guys for being here today and watching the replay. If you're not here with us live, we'll be back next week for chapter 3. And the teaser for that one is called The Most Important Moment in the History of the World. So you can imagine and think about what that would mean. So is there anything else that you want to add for people watching today?
No, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you again for doing this. It's a very special treat, and we appreciate you guys being here. Take care, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.